factory worker helps a clueless new guy. What happened next exposed the whole company. Before we get into this story, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And if you enjoy stories like these, make sure to subscribe, as we upload at the same time every day. Ethan wiped the sweat off his brow, feeling the clammy texture of his work gloves against his temple. He just finished a grueling shift at the factory, 12 hours of non-stop clanging machinery, and the ever-present haze of dust and fumes that clung to every surface. The usual fatigue should have led him straight to clocking out, but something odd caught his eye. A new guy stood by one of the older machines, fumbling with the controls like someone trying to crack a code written in an alien language. Ethan had never seen him before, and in a place where workers rarely lasted if they didn't learn fast, it struck him as unusual that this man looked so completely lost. Immediately, Ethan's gut told him something was off. Why? Because the new guy's uniform was spotless, no hint of grime or oil, almost as if it had just been pressed. Around here, even brand new hires rarely kept their shirts that clean beyond the first hour. Yet this man appeared untouched by the dirt and chaos of the assembly line. Within 3 sentences of meeting him, Ethan had already spotted a red flag. The man didn't even know how to clock in. "Hey, buddy, you need help with that?" Ethan asked, noticing the man tapping the digital punch-in screen with a frustrated grimace. The stranger nodded, relieved. "Thanks. I'm Ben," he said, fumbling to align his ID badge with the scanner. "Is there some sort of trick to this thing?" Ethan chuckled, reached over, and guided the badge to the correct spot. The device beeped. "Listen, it's easy once you get the hang of it. You line it up this way, see?" The new guy, Ben, smiled awkwardly, then took a step back, as if worried he might accidentally break the machine. Ethan found it a bit odd. Normally, new hires tried to act tough, eager to impress the old hands. This man seemed genuinely unsure of his every move. As they walked across the noisy factory floor, Ethan pointed out the different stations, the assembly line, the packaging area, and the storeroom. The thunderous hum of conveyor belts, and the whining screech of metal parts being pressed into shape were overwhelming. Ben seemed fascinated, but also on edge, as though he was studying each section with more than a casual interest. He asked questions about the efficiency, the production rate, and how often the machines needed maintenance. Most newcomers asked about breaks, wages, or how strict the supervisors were. Ben's questions were oddly specific, like a manager or maybe even a corporate auditor. That was another little flag that fluttered in Ethan's mind. Still, he shrugged it off. "You see all the signs when you've been here as long as I have," Ethan told himself. Probably just a curious type. But the feeling that something deeper was going on stuck with him. They stopped by the break room, a cramped space with a flickering fluorescent light and vending machines that constantly jammed. Ben stared at the snack selection as if he'd never seen such limited options. "You'd think there'd be healthier food," he commented. Ethan shrugged. "Management isn't too concerned about that. They figure if we wanted healthy food, we'd pack lunch from home. Plus, this place is so remote, we can't exactly run out for a quick bite." Ben muttered something under his breath and inserted a few coins, only for the machine to eat them without dispensing anything. "Great, just my luck," Ben sighed. Ethan gave the machine a swift kick, and lo and behold, it spat out the bag of chips. Ben blinked in surprise, then tried to laugh off the awkward moment. When Ethan led him to the floor supervisor to officially sign in, the supervisor barely gave Ben a glance. Instead, he fixed Ethan with a glare that could melt steel. "Slacking off again, are we?" the supervisor sneered. "We got deadlines, and I don't need you babysitting." Ethan held his tongue. This was typical. The supervisors here thrived on intimidation. But it angered him that Ben was treated like a nuisance on his very first day. That's when Ethan realized that the environment here had grown even more toxic than usual. People were tense, shoulders hunched, eyes scanning for any sign they might get singled out. Ben, for his part, seemed taken aback by the supervisor's hostility. He mumbled an introduction, but the supervisor waved him off. "If he can't handle a machine, he's useless to me," the supervisor barked. "That's your problem, Not mine, Ethan. If he slows you down, both of you will be written up. Ethan felt a tight knot in his stomach. This was how it always went: blame the worker for any inefficiency, pit them against each other. Glancing at Ben, Ethan saw genuine shock on his face. No one had explained just how brutal it could be in here, but now he was getting a crash course. Ethan guided Ben to a spot on the assembly line, showed him how to feed the raw materials into the press, and then boxed the finished parts. Ben tried his best, but the conveyor moved fast, and the tasks required a practice rhythm. Within minutes he was behind, and a chorus of groans and curses rippled down the line. The experienced workers were too swamped to help. If they paused, they'd fall behind, too. Ethan had to step in, moving swiftly between his station and Ben's to make sure nothing jammed. The foreman stormed over, eyebrows knitted. You two think this is a charity? We got quotas. Pick up the pace or there'll be hell to pay. Ben glanced at Ethan apologetically, but Ethan just gave a weary nod. It's okay. You'll get used to it. But inside, Ethan felt a twinge of guilt. He remembered his own first weeks, when the machines felt like monstrous beasts demanding tribute of sweat and blood. The least he could do now was lend a hand, even if management hated it. By the time the bells signaled their break, Ethan was drenched in sweat. As they walked back to the locker area, Ben's questions started again. This place is insane. The foreman acts like he doesn't care if we lose a finger. Don't we have safety protocols? Ethan scoffed. There are protocols, sure, but they aren't enforced. Hell, last month a guy lost half a hand because a safety guard was never repaired. Company said it was user error. Ben's expression darkened. That's ridiculous. Hasn't anyone reported them to HR or OSHA? Ethan sighed. People tried, but the ones who speak up don't last. Hours get cut. People get mysteriously laid off. It's a system built to keep us quiet. Ben looked genuinely disturbed. That's so corrupt. This is a huge company, right? They can't afford a couple repairs and some safety gear? Ethan let out a bitter laugh. You don't get it. They can afford it. They just don't want to. Profits come first. If you want to last here, keep your head down, do your job, and don't piss off the wrong people. Ben hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. Right, yeah, thanks for the advice. That evening, as the shift ended, Ethan noticed Ben lingering in the corner, making notes on a small pad. Ethan couldn't help but wonder if Ben was writing a formal complaint. Let it go, Ethan. It's none of your business. But part of him was deeply curious about who this guy really was, and why he seemed to be investigating the factory with such intensity. The next morning, Ethan arrived, muscles sore and mind groggy from too little sleep. He found Ben already there, staring at a machine with a perplexed look. Again, Ethan stepped in. You gotta watch out for that lever. It sticks sometimes, so pull it slow or you'll jam the press. Ben nodded, murmuring his thanks, but then he blurted out, Why is it broken if it's so crucial? Shouldn't they replace it? The frustration in his voice was palpable. Ethan gave him a sidelong glance. Didn't we talk about this? The company doesn't care. Replacing it costs money, and they figure a few jammed parts are cheaper than fixing the lever. That's how it goes. Ben turned toward Ethan, his eyebrows furrowed. How long have you been here? Ethan wiped the back of his hand across his forehead. Going on 8 years. Learned the ropes, learn how not to get myself fired, you know? Why do you stick around if it's this bad? Ben asked, genuinely baffled. Ethan shrugged. Jobs are hard to come by, especially in this town. Most of us have families to feed. We can't afford to lose what little we have. A flicker of empathy crossed Ben's face. He opened his mouth, as if to say something else, but the foreman barked for them to get to work, so he stayed quiet. They resumed their posts, the clang of metal on metal roaring in their ears. Within the first hour, the same supervisor from the day before came by to do his usual intimidation rounds. He zeroed in on Ben, scowling. You're still too slow. Speed it up. Production's down because of you. Ethan gritted his teeth. If the supervisor wanted to blame someone, he should blame the ancient, malfunctioning machinery. But that was the unspoken rule: never blame the company, never blame the machines, blame the worker. Ben forced a polite nod. "I'm doing my best, sir." The supervisor snorted. "Your best ain't good enough. Don't make me regret not firing you yesterday." Then he stomped off. Ethan shot Ben a sympathetic look, but Ben's eyes were focused and determined, as if he'd just made an internal decision. Later, at lunch, which was basically a hurried 15-minute break, Ethan found Ben poring over some factory guidelines pinned to a bulletin board. They were outdated, but Ben scrutinized them as though searching for hidden clues. "Why are you looking at that?" Ethan asked, taking a bite of a stale sandwich. "Just checking something," Ben replied, gesturing to a line about fair treatment, equal opportunity, and safe working conditions. "Seems like they're violating half of these." Ethan nodded. "Welcome to the real world." That's corporate lingo to keep themselves covered. The day wore on. Over in the packaging section, a new meltdown was brewing. One of the older workers, Carl, accidentally stumbled and knocked over a crate of freshly assembled parts. Immediately, the foreman raced over, shouting, "Look what you've done! You realize how much this is gonna cost us?" Carl apologized profusely, his voice trembling. He was on the verge of tears. The foreman threatened to dock Carl's pay to compensate for the damaged goods. Ben stared at the scene, appalled. Why doesn't he just fill out an incident report? Ethan mumbled, "Because here, the second you file a report, you become a target. They'll find a way to make your life hell until you quit or they fire you." Ben clenched his jaw. "That's not right." Ethan could only shrug. "It is what it is. We're all used to it." But as he looked at Ben, Ethan realized the new guy wasn't accepting this place's rules. He was silently outraged. That afternoon, the forklift driver nearly sideswiped Ben as he was crossing the floor. "Watch it!" the driver yelled, too busy trying to juggle 3 tasks. Ben jumped back just in time, eyes wide. "Doesn't anyone care about safety here?" he shouted, looking around. A few workers glanced at him sympathetically, but most kept their heads down. No one wanted extra attention. When the shift ended, Ben asked Ethan for a ride home. Ethan agreed, though he was a little hesitant. But once they got into Ethan's old pickup, the tension that had been building up all day erupted. Ben began questioning Ethan about the chain of command, how many people worked in this factory, what kind of oversight existed. Ethan found the inquisition strange. "Dude, you're really going deep on this," Ethan remarked, keeping his eyes on the winding road. Ben stared out the window. "I just think if people stood up together, maybe things could change." Ethan sighed. "We've thought about that. Some tried to unionize, but management found out. Those people don't work here anymore." Ben let out a frustrated groan. "So they operate on fear. That's how they keep everyone in line." Ethan nodded. "Exactly. People have families, medical bills, mortgages. No one wants to risk it." By the time Ethan dropped Ben off at a modest apartment complex, the sun was setting. "Be safe," Ethan said, half joking, but the concern in his voice was real. "You keep asking these questions, you might become a target yourself." Ben offered a small smile. "Thanks for the ride, and for looking out for me. But don't worry, I'm not afraid of them." The next morning, rumors were swirling that corporate executives were planning a visit next month. Usually, that meant the place got a hasty cleanup and fresh coats of paint in certain areas to hide the worst of the decay. But the mention of executives also put everyone on edge. If they found production lacking, heads would roll. Ethan noticed that Ben seemed to perk up at this news. He asked multiple people about when the executives were supposed to arrive and what they typically did. People found it odd. Some said they just do a quick tour, shake a few hands, and vanish, leaving behind impossible new targets for production. Others said the executives never bothered to see the real working conditions. They stuck to the cleaned-up sections, took some photos, and left. By lunchtime, the foreman had already told people to keep quiet about any issues or face disciplinary action. The threat was clear: Don't you dare mention anything that might make us look bad in front of corporate. Ethan, hearing this, felt the weight of hopelessness he'd carried for so long. Even if the big shots came, it was all a show. No real changes would happen. Ben, meanwhile, was busy writing in his little notebook again. Ethan wondered, maybe he's doing this in hopes that when those executives come, he'll show them the truth. But that was dangerous thinking. That evening, Ethan caught Ben searching through a pile of old boxes near the manager's office, rummaging like he was on a mission. Ethan hurried over. Are you nuts? If they catch you here. Ben hushed him. I'm looking for past complaint files, or something that shows how bad this place really is. We can't let them keep doing this to people. Ethan's heart pounded. He admired the courage but also feared the consequence. Then they heard footsteps. The manager's voice echoed down the corridor, cursing about some missing paperwork. Ethan grabbed Ben by the sleeve, and they ducked behind a row of cabinets. Hearts pounding, they waited until the manager stomped off. After that close call, Ethan practically dragged Ben out of the office area, whispering furiously. You want to lose your job? Or get us both fired? Ben sighed, rubbing his temples. I just can't stand it. This place is run like a sweatshop. Doesn't anyone in upper management see that? Ethan shook his head. Either they don't see it, or they don't care. Both are just as bad. That night, Ethan barely slept, his mind racing. The new guy was stirring trouble, or maybe he was trying to fix the unfixable. Either way, a collision with the higher-ups felt inevitable. And in this place, collisions usually ended badly for the workers. He found himself wishing he could do more, but the memory of all those who tried and failed kept him cautious. Ben, however, seemed like someone who wouldn't be deterred, no matter the risk. By midweek, tensions on the factory floor were at a boiling point. The old machinery kept breaking down, production quotas were climbing, and the supervisors were dishing out threats like candy. Ethan overheard them talking about cutting bathroom breaks again, a typical intimidation tactic. One time, they tried forcing workers to sign a form waiving their right to certain breaks under the pretense of improving efficiency. People signed out of fear. Ben couldn't believe it when Ethan told him. That's insane. You can't force people to give up basic human rights. But insanity had become the norm here. No matter how bad it got, management always found a way to ratchet up the pressure just a bit more. The day's big drama hit when a young worker, Nick, arrived 5 minutes late because his car broke down. The supervisor tore into him in front of everyone, calling him lazy, unreliable, and a drain on the company. Nick tried to explain, but it only fueled the supervisor's anger. Then the supervisor said the words everyone dreaded, "That's it, you're done here. Pack up your things. You're fired." Nick stood there, stunned, tears welling in his eyes as he realized he might not be able to pay rent this month. A knot twisted in Ethan's gut. Normally, he would keep his head down, but he'd reached a tipping point. Before he knew it, he stepped forward. "Sir, that's not right. He's only 5 minutes late. Half the machines here break down more often than he does." The floor supervisor's face turned crimson. "You got a smart mouth, Ethan. You want me to fire you, too?" Ethan swallowed hard, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes on him. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Ben, fists clenched, looking ready to jump in. But Ethan shook his head subtly, signaling for him to back off. This was Ethan's risk to take. The supervisor marched over, standing so close Ethan could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "You people need to learn your place. If I say he's out, he's out." That's when Ben spoke up, voice firm. "You can't fire someone for being late once. It's not only unethical, it could be illegal if it's not policy." The supervisor whipped around, glaring at Ben. "And who the hell are you to talk about policy? You've been here 5 minutes, you think you know how this place runs?" Without missing a beat, Ben replied, "Maybe I don't know everything about this factory, but I know labor laws." Ethan's heart thundered. This was escalating faster than he'd ever seen. The other workers watched silently, fear etched on their faces. They'd seen what happens when you challenge the boss, and it never ended well. The supervisor let out a bark of laughter. Labor laws? Kid, this is real life, not some textbook. In real life, we do what we want, and if you don't like it, you can walk. Or better yet, I'll throw you out myself. Ethan could almost see the veins bulging in the supervisor's neck. This was dangerous territory. Any second now, the supervisor might lash out physically, or worse, call higher management and have them both fired. Nick, voice shaking, spoke up. Just give me one more chance, please. My family. The supervisor cut him off. Save it. A crowd was forming now, workers quietly gathering behind the machines, half hidden in the gloom, but watching every move. This was the most open defiance they'd seen in a while. And defiance here was a rare commodity. Ben locked eyes with the supervisor. You really want to go down that road? Firing people without cause? Do you know how quickly this could blow up in your face if the right people found out? The supervisor sneered. The right people? Who do you think is in charge here? This is a top-down culture. You file a complaint with HR, it goes straight in the trash. You call OSHA, we'll bury you in legal fees until you back off. We've been running this game for years, and we're still here. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Ethan tensed, ready to intervene if things turned physical. Then, seemingly satisfied he'd made his point, the supervisor jabbed a finger in Nick's direction. Fine. You can stay. But one more slip-up, you're gone, and I'll make sure you never work in this industry again. The supervisor stormed off, leaving a suffocating tension in the air. Nick sank to his knees, relief and fear mixing in his teary eyes. Ethan placed a hand on Nick's shoulder. Glad you're still with us, man. But be careful. Nick nodded, still trembling. Ben exhaled slowly, as if wrestling with his own anger. That evening, in the locker room, a few workers quietly thanked Ethan and Ben. You guys said what we've all been wanting to say for years, one woman confessed. Another man added, maybe if we all stand up together, they'll finally back off. But older employees shook their heads. Don't do it. They'll retaliate. That's how this place works. Ethan noticed Ben slip away to a corner, where he began furiously jotting something down in his notebook. Ethan approached him. Hey, you okay? Ben nodded, but his voice was tense. I'm just documenting everything, time, date, what the supervisor said. If this goes to a legal battle, we need evidence. Ethan's heart rate spiked. A legal battle? You're going big, aren't you? Ben pressed his lips together. I don't know yet. But I can't just stand by. Ethan glanced around to make sure no one was listening. You're playing a dangerous game. Ben's gaze sharpened. Maybe. But the game they're playing is worse. That night, Ethan barely slept again. Images of the confrontation looped in his head. He thought about how Nick nearly lost his livelihood over a minor tardiness. And he thought about Ben, openly challenging the powers that be. Usually, new hires were timid, but Ben was the complete opposite. He was either too naive to understand the danger, or he had a strong conviction that made fear irrelevant. Ethan could respect that, but he worried how it would end for both of them. He'd seen too many good people chewed up and spit out by this place. The thought that it might happen again gnawed at him, making rest impossible. Still, a small spark of hope flickered. For the first time, someone had stood up publicly, refused to accept the abusive rules. A handful of workers seemed emboldened, whispering about maybe, just maybe, uniting. On the other hand, the supervisor had clearly taken note, and likely so had the manager. If they caught wind that a rebellion was brewing, it would be crushed swiftly. Ethan thought about his own financial situation, the rent, the bills, the dream of saving enough money to get out of this dead-end town. Standing up to management could jeopardize all of that. He wondered if Ben truly understood the stakes, or if he even cared. Come morning, Ethan found the atmosphere on the factory floor was simmering with mixed emotions, fear, tension, and a faint undercurrent of resolve. People whispered to each other about what happened yesterday. Some praised Ethan and Ben, while others condemned their recklessness, saying it would make everything worse. The assembly line started up with its usual ear-splitting grind. Within the first hour, the foreman was back to barking orders, but there was a new layer of suspicion in his gaze whenever he looked at Ethan or Ben. Management smelled a threat, and they were ready to squash it the moment it grew too big. Ethan worked faster than usual, partly to keep up and partly to avoid drawing attention. Ben did the same, though Ethan noticed his face was set in a grim expression. He seemed like a man who had already made up his mind about what needed to be done, and no amount of fear would stop him now. That afternoon, an event triggered a new spark of rebellion. The foreman insisted everyone stay an additional 2 hours beyond their shift, unpaid, to meet an unexpected production quota. Workers groaned, some with tears in their eyes because they had personal obligations, picking up kids from school, caring for elderly parents, or attending second jobs. But fear kept most mouths shut. They couldn't risk losing even this miserable job. Ben looked around, jaw tightening. Unpaid overtime is illegal, he hissed under his breath. Ethan gave him a subtle shake of the head, silently pleading, "Don't push it." But inside, Ethan was just as outraged. The crisis escalated when Mary, a single mother, begged the foreman to let her leave to pick up her daughter. The foreman told her to stay or consider herself unemployed. Mary broke down crying right on the factory floor, tears streaming down her cheeks, but still not daring to leave her station. The heartbreak in her eyes cut through Ethan's soul. He wanted to tell the foreman off, to shout that this was inhumane. But he also knew what happened to Nick yesterday. Management retaliated at the slightest hint of defiance. Suddenly, another worker, a tall man named Reggie, stepped forward, confronting the foreman. "This isn't right, man. You can't keep us here for free. That's not how things work." The foreman whirled on him, eyes blazing. "You want to challenge me? You think you're some hero? We have an order to fill, and you'll do it, or you'll be on the street." The tension pulsed through the room. In that moment, Ethan saw Ben slowly inch forward, clearly about to speak up again. A hush fell over the workers as they realized a confrontation was brewing. Reggie took a deep breath, bracing himself. "You can't exploit us like this. We're not machines." The foreman smirked. "Spare me the sob story. You all signed the terms of employment. We can schedule you as needed." Reggie's voice rose, anger shining in his eyes. "Scheduled is one thing, forcing people to work extra hours unpaid is another. That's wage theft." The foreman let out a cruel laugh. "Wage theft? Good luck proving that. And if you can handle some extra time, I'm sure there are plenty of desperate folks who'd take your job in a heartbeat." The threat hung in the air. Reggie looked around, and for a brief moment, he locked eyes with Ethan and Ben. A silent plea for backup passed between them. Ben spoke up, tone controlled but firm. "You're pushing people beyond their limits. You realize that, right?" The foreman's smirk vanished. He stomped over, chest puffed out. "You again. Didn't I warn you about running your mouth?" Ben didn't flinch. "This is inhumane, and you know it. We all do." The foreman jabbed a finger into Ben's chest. "You want to keep working here? I suggest you shut it. Otherwise, I'll personally see you blacklisted from every factory in the region." A ripple of shock traveled through the gathering crowd. Blacklisting someone was a near certain sentence to unemployment in this town. At that moment, Mary's sobs grew louder, and Reggie stood beside her protectively. "She has a child to pick up," he said in a quieter but no less firm voice. "Have a heart, man." The foreman rolled his eyes. "Her personal life is not my problem. Quotas are. If she can't cut it, she's free to leave, forever." Mary sobbed harder, torn between her child and her job. The workers looked on helplessly, each one weighed down by their own fears. Ethan felt his pulse hammering. His mind screamed at him to stay silent, but his conscience told him otherwise. He stepped forward, gently placing a hand on Mary's shoulder. "Look, this is a person's life. We're all working ourselves ragged here. Have some compassion." The foreman's eyes flicked to Ethan, then back to Ben. "Compassion doesn't fill quotas, does it?" Ethan opened his mouth to argue, but Ben cut in before he could speak. The new hire's tone was cold now. "Is that how you see it? Nothing matters except your production numbers? The foreman bared his teeth. That's how the whole company sees it, wise guy. You think I'm the only one who enforces these rules? Try complaining upstairs. See if they care. We're under orders to maximize output, and we do what we have to do. Ben's lips pressed into a thin line. For a second, Ethan thought he saw raw fury in Ben's eyes, as if some final straw had been snapped. But then Ben glanced at Mary, who was trembling, her tears streaking her dirt-smudged cheeks. Enough, he said quietly. Mary, go pick up your daughter. I'll cover for you. The foreman snorted. Cover for her? You can't possibly do both jobs at once. I'll try, said Ben. At least it buys her time. Mary looked up with a hopeful, tearful gaze, clearly torn. The foreman started shouting. You leave this building, you're done. She stood frozen, paralyzed by fear. Then Ethan stepped up beside Ben. We'll handle her station together. She deserves to be able to take care of her kid. Reggie joined them, arms folded defiantly. Me too. Let's see them fire all of us. A strange hush overtook the crowd of workers. For a moment, it felt like the first taste of solidarity Ethan had experienced in years. The foreman was outnumbered, but he still held the power to fire them all. Don't test me, he threatened. But Mary, tears still glistening, hesitantly set down her gear. She took a step toward the exit, eyes darting around as if expecting security to drag her back. No one moved to stop her. The foreman turned red with rage, but he didn't call security. Perhaps he realized how bad it would look to physically restrain a crying mother from picking up her child. Or maybe he sensed the brewing rebellion was too hot to handle all at once. Mary slipped away, and Ethan felt a surge of relief. The foreman hissed, Fine, you want to do her work? You'll do it without a break. If you fall behind, I swear I'll have all your heads. Then he walked off, still fuming. The rest of the workers exchanged glances, a mixture of fear and awe. No one had seen open defiance like this in a long time. Some quietly cheered, but most just rushed back to their stations, not wanting to draw more attention. Reggie grinned at Ethan and Ben. We did the right thing, he said softly. Let's just hope we don't all regret it. Ben exhaled, wiping sweat from his brow. We'll manage. Even though Ethan's heart was pounding, a flicker of pride glowed in his chest. He'd done something good, something that felt moral and justified, even if it put him in the firing line. Together, they hurried to keep up with both tasks. The rest of the shift was a frenzy of manual labor, the conveyor never stopping, the pace relentless. By the time it was over, Ethan's muscles screamed, and Ben's shirt was drenched through. But they'd managed to hold their ground. Mary returned 2 hours later, breathless and grateful. She mumbled teary thanks to them before hurrying back to her station. At the end of the day, the foreman made a point to corner Ethan, Ben, and Reggie as they were leaving. You might think you won something today, but you haven't. This is my floor, and I won't tolerate insubordination. All three men stood there, exhaustion etched on their faces. None of them responded. They had nothing left to say. As Ethan walked away, he noticed Ben's knuckles were white from clenching his fists so hard. Something told Ethan that after this, there would be no going back to the quiet acceptance of the status quo. The lines had been drawn, and war, perhaps only a verbal one, but a war nonetheless, was in the air. Word spread quickly about how Mary had been allowed to leave to pick up her daughter, thanks to Ben, Ethan, and Reggie standing up. The factory workers buzzed with conflicting emotions, hope that things might change and dread about the backlash that was sure to come. The manager, a middle-aged man named Phillips, made a rare appearance on the floor the next morning. Usually, he stayed holed up in his office, relying on the supervisors to maintain order. But the rumor of open defiance must have brought him out of hiding. Right after the shift started, Phillips marched out, flanked by 2 supervisors. He called the entire assembly line to a halt, ignoring the screech of machines winding down. The workers gathered around, eyes darting with anxiety. Phillips cleared his throat, scanning the crowd. I've heard about some issues of insubordination. Let me make this clear, we run a tight ship here. If you can't handle it, you're free to find employment elsewhere. His tone was dismissive, as though the workers were children to be chastised. People exchanged nervous glances but remained silent. Phillips continued, "This is a production facility, not a charity. We have orders to fill, and we expect everyone to pull their weight. If anyone has a problem with that, my door is open. But rest assured, we have zero tolerance for troublemakers." Ethan stood near the back, arms crossed, listening. He could feel the tension radiating from the supervisors. Ben was a few feet away, expression tight with suppressed anger. Phillips wrapped up his speech with a vague mention of how the corporate visit was coming soon, and they needed to show the higher-ups how efficient and disciplined they were. Then, as if concluding a sermon, he waved dismissively for everyone to get back to work. The crowd dispersed with a collective sigh, relief that no one was singled out, yet. But the threat was real. An hour later, Ethan found himself elbow to elbow with Ben on the assembly line. The roar of machinery made conversation nearly impossible, so they communicated with quick glances and nods. Every now and then, Ethan caught sight of the manager and supervisors huddled together in tense discussion, their eyes flicking toward Ben and Ethan. They were planning something, no doubt. That knowledge made Ethan's stomach churn. During the afternoon break, Ethan and Ben found a quiet corner behind a stack of sealed boxes. Ben's face was grim. "They're not going to stop until we either shut up or leave," he muttered. Ethan nodded. "True enough. But what can we do? If we push too hard, they'll fire us." Ben hesitated, then said softly, "There's got to be a higher authority, someone who cares about labor laws." Ethan let out a weary chuckle. "Higher authority? If you call the labor board, they'll send an inspector, sure. But management will hide everything or bribe someone, or make it look like we're lying." Before Ben could respond, Reggie appeared, glancing around to ensure no one else was listening. "I heard rumors that corporate is sending not just a random executive, but someone high up. The CEO himself might be doing an undercover visit. People are saying it's part of some initiative to see how the factories actually run." Ethan snorted in disbelief. "The CEO? Here? That's impossible. He's probably off in some skyscraper office counting profits." Reggie shrugged. "That's what I heard. If it's true, maybe that's our chance. If the top boss sees what's really going on, he could step in." Ben, oddly quiet, cast his gaze down. "Or he could fire us all on the spot if we make him look bad," Ethan pointed out. Reggie sighed. "Either way, something's coming. Just be prepared." Ethan returned to the line, mind whirling with the possibility. The CEO in this dump? It sounded like a fairy tale. Meanwhile, Ben worked with a new intensity, as if something inside him had steeled. He didn't complain anymore about the tasks or the supervisors. He just did the job, occasionally jotting in his notebook whenever he thought no one was looking. Ethan worried that if management caught him documenting things, it would be over. But he also felt a tiny thrill at the possibility that maybe all of this was building toward a reckoning. Later that shift, the manager singled out an exhausted elderly worker named Harold. Harold was struggling to keep the pace, sweat dripping from his brow as he tried to lift heavy parts. Instead of offering assistance, or assigning someone younger to help, the manager berated him in front of everyone. "You're slowing down the entire line. If you can't handle the load, retire already." Harold's face flushed, but he kept his head down. The manager turned to the rest of the workers, as if using Harold as an example. "This is what I'm talking about. Dead weight. Step it up, or there'll be consequences." Ben's voice cut through the commotion. "He doesn't look like dead weight to me. Just a guy who's overworked." The manager's eyes snapped to Ben. "You again," he sneered, stepping closer. "Your mouth is going to get you in serious trouble." Ethan flinched inwardly, anticipating the blow-up, but Ben stood his ground. "Why are you attacking him? Why not assign more people to help, or rotate tasks?" The manager's lips curled in disdain. "Because that would cost time and reduce efficiency. This is a business, not a daycare." Harold lowered his eyes, as if silently thanking Ben but terrified to speak up. The manager raised his voice so everyone could hear. If any of you think I'm being unfair, go ahead, walk out. Don't come begging for your job tomorrow. Ben, fists at his sides, said nothing more, likely sensing that another argument could be the final straw. But Ethan saw the frustration etched into Ben's features. It was as if every injustice fueled a growing fire inside him. When the shift finally ended, a drained Harold trudged away, shoulders sagging. Ben watched him go with an expression that said he wanted to do more but didn't know how. Ethan approached quietly. He wanted to ask Ben why he cared so much. Most new hires just tried to survive, but Ben was almost on a crusade. But before Ethan could speak, Ben gave him a faint, tense smile. I'm going to keep gathering info. Someone has to do something. Without waiting for a reply, Ben strode off, leaving Ethan with a tumult of questions swirling in his mind. Walking to his car, Ethan replayed the day's events. The manager's threat, Phillips's speech, Mary's tears, Nick's near-firing, Harold's humiliation, it was all building to a head. He wondered if Reggie's rumor held any truth, if the CEO might actually appear. And if so, what would that change? If management found out the workers were prepared to speak up, they'd retaliate harder than ever. But maybe, just maybe, the CEO would see the toxic culture for what it was and sweep away the abusers. Then again, this was reality, not a fairy tale. The system rarely worked that way. Ethan climbed into his beat-up truck, tossing his lunchbox onto the passenger seat. As he drove home, he couldn't shake the feeling of impending confrontation. He knew it wouldn't be long before everything came crashing down, one way or another. In the back of his mind, a voice whispered that he should keep his head down, maintain the status quo. But another voice, louder, insisted that it was time to stand up for what was right, no matter the consequences. He had no idea which path to choose, or whether he'd even have a choice when the final reckoning arrived. The climax seemed near when, just a few days later, the manager gathered everyone for an emergency meeting right after lunch break. Tension sizzled in the air as the machines ground to a halt. Supervisors stood around like prison guards, arms crossed, eyes scanning the workers for any sign of dissent. The manager cleared his throat, looking both smug and anxious. We have big news. The CEO is visiting tomorrow. The announcement sent an electric jolt through the crowd. Some gasped, others exchanged wary glances. Ethan felt his heart skip a beat. So Reggie's rumor was true. The manager continued, this means we need this place in top shape. No whining, no complaining, no messing around. Anyone who tries to sabotage this visit or embarrass this facility will face serious consequences. He paused, letting the threat sink in. Let's make one thing clear, you answer the CEO's questions politely, you show him how efficient we are, and you smile. If you can't do that, don't bother showing up tomorrow. We'll consider you self-terminated. Then he dismissed the group with a wave of his hand. The workers shuffled back to their stations, anxiety plainly etched on their faces. Ethan found Ben leaning against the railing, staring at the now silent assembly line. If the CEO's really coming, maybe he'll see the truth for himself, Ethan said softly. Ben glanced at him, eyes searching. That depends on who he talks to. If the manager controls the narrative, the CEO might see only what they want him to see. They'll keep him away from the real conditions. Ethan nodded. True. Maybe we should try to talk to him directly. Expose everything. Ben set his jaw. That's exactly what we need to do. But it's risky. The manager will be watching us like a hawk. The following day, the factory was transformed, or at least tidied. Workers arrived to find fresh paint slapped on certain walls, new signage posted about safety, ironic, Ethan thought, and some of the older machines temporarily hidden behind curtains, labeled under repair. It was a facade, a desperate attempt to hide the real state of affairs. Supervisors hovered like wasps, barking at anyone who dared to slow down or look the least bit unenthused. By mid-morning, a hush fell over the building. The CEO had arrived. Ethan had never seen him before, only pictures in company newsletters. He was surprisingly young, maybe early 30s, wearing a simple button-down shirt and jeans. He looked more like a mid-level manager than a CEO of a massive corporation. A few executives accompanied him, all in crisp suits, but he moved ahead, scanning the factory with what appeared to be genuine curiosity. The manager quickly stepped forward, greeting him with a forced smile. "You'll find everything running smoothly, sir. We pride ourselves on efficiency." The CEO offered a polite nod, glancing around. Ethan and Ben were assigned to a far corner, where the CEO was less likely to wander. But ironically, the CEO seemed more interested in exploring the less polished areas, ignoring the manager's attempts to steer him toward the newly painted sections. He paused near an ancient press machine that squealed with every cycle, watching with concern. One of the suits whispered something in his ear, and he frowned slightly. Meanwhile, the manager hurried over, guiding the CEO away. "We can continue this way, sir. Let me show you our top-of-the-line machinery." Ben nudged Ethan. "This is our chance. Let's try to talk to him." Ethan's heart pounded. "Are you sure? If the manager catches us..." Ben gave him a determined look. "If we don't do it now, we'll never get another chance." They set down their tools and discreetly maneuvered through the rows of equipment, edging closer to where the CEO was headed. They saw him pause by a cluster of workers who had been instructed to assemble a special demonstration product. The manager watched like a hawk, nodding vigorously every time the CEO asked a question. Finally, Ben broke away from Ethan, stepping forward. "Excuse me, sir," he called out, voice carrying over the din of machinery. The CEO turned, eyebrows raised. The manager scowled. "This is one of our new hires," the manager said quickly, obviously trying to dismiss Ben. "Don't worry, he's still learning the ropes." Ben ignored the manager and addressed the CEO directly. "Sir, I'd like to show you another part of the factory. There's more to see than what they're showing you." The CEO seemed intrigued, but the manager interjected, "We have a strict schedule, sir. Let's stick to the planned route." Ben pressed on. "Please. It's important you see how some of the older machines are running, and how the workers are treated." The tension skyrocketed. The manager shot daggers at Ben, and one of the suited executives stepped forward, looking displeased. The CEO, however, studied Ben for a moment. He glanced at the manager, then back at Ben. "Let's hear him out," the CEO said calmly, surprising everyone. The manager's face twitched, but he had no choice. Ben beckoned the CEO to follow him. Ethan felt compelled to join, heart in his throat. A small entourage formed: the CEO, a couple of executives, the manager, and an increasingly nervous supervisor. They walked past the pristine demonstration area into the real heart of the factory, the part that was deliberately neglected for the visit. The CEO's eyes widened at the sight of the dilapidated equipment, the thick layer of dust in corners, the dangerously exposed wiring. Workers paused, startled to see the big boss in their domain. The manager scrambled to explain, "We're in the process of renovating, sir." The CEO's expression was unreadable. Ben quietly pointed out how some of the machines lacked safety guards, how employees had to manually clear jams, risking injury. The manager grew visibly agitated, trying to downplay each issue. Then, in a moment that froze everyone's blood, the CEO reached out to examine a frayed cable attached to a main press. He turned to the manager, face serious. "Is this normal?" The manager stammered, "Well, it's scheduled for repair." Ben, fed up with the lies, spoke up. "It's been like that for months, sir. Management never fixes it." The manager's composure cracked. "That's not true. We've had it on the schedule." The CEO looked from Ben to the manager, obviously trying to gauge who was telling the truth. Meanwhile, the executives shifted uncomfortably, likely wondering if they should intervene. Ethan stepped in, unable to stay silent. "He's telling the truth, sir. I've been here 8 years, and I've seen that cable get patched with duct tape more times than I can count." The manager spun on Ethan, eyes blazing. "You're out of line." The CEO held up a hand. "Let them speak." The manager, clearly angry but forced into compliance, pursed his lips. The CEO then addressed Ethan. "What else do you have to say?" Ethan hesitated, heart hammering so loudly he was sure everyone could hear it. But the memory of Mary's tears and Harold's humiliation emboldened him. Sir, the conditions here are dangerous, and we're often forced to do unpaid overtime. People are afraid to speak up because they need their jobs. A tense silence followed. The manager tried to laugh it off. These are isolated complaints. We've been dealing with some whining from new hires who don't understand our standards. But the CEO's gaze was on Ben. And you? What's your experience? Ben took a breath, looking the CEO straight in the eye. I've worked here a short time, sir, but it's enough to see the abuse, the fear tactics, and the lack of basic safety. This place is a lawsuit waiting to happen, and I doubt that's what you want for your company. The CEO's face grew stern. He glanced at the executives, then the manager, who was now sweating visibly. The manager forced a grin. Let's not blow this out of proportion. Our records are pristine. This is a top-performing facility. The CEO frowned. I'd like to see those records. And I'd like to speak with more of the workers, privately. The manager paled, stammering some excuse. The entire group stood there in a standoff, the hum of machinery filling the silence. It was clear the manager's plan to hide the factory's real conditions had just crumbled in front of the CEO's eyes. Ethan wondered if they'd all just signed their own termination notices. But at the same time, he felt a rush of courage. At least the truth was out in the open now, where it couldn't be ignored. Back on the assembly line, word spread like wildfire that Ben and Ethan had confronted the CEO about the factory's real issues. Some workers looked at them with admiration, mouthing silent thank you as they passed. Others shook their heads, convinced that they were courting disaster. Still, the uneasy sense that a massive shift was underway permeated the air. The manager and the supervisors were more agitated than ever, obviously terrified that their carefully maintained facade was collapsing. Midway through the shift, the CEO did something no one expected. He returned to the floor alone, without the manager or executives. He walked around, asking workers how they liked the job, what their biggest challenges were, how they felt about safety measures. Though people were scared to speak frankly, the CEO seemed approachable, listening intently to every half-whispered complaint. Ethan kept his distance, not wanting to draw attention, but he noticed the CEO nodding solemnly as a few bold souls described the harsh realities. Ben, unable to restrain himself, finally approached. Sir, I'd like you to meet one of my friends here, Reggie. He's been around a while, and he can tell you about the forced overtime. Reggie stepped forward, looking nervous. The CEO offered a reassuring smile. Please, go ahead. Reggie took a breath. We're often told to stay hours late, off the clock, or face disciplinary action. Some of us have families, second jobs, responsibilities. The CEO's brows furrowed. That's illegal. Reggie nodded. We know. But no one dares challenge it. The CEO glanced around as if noticing the watchers, supervisors lurking nearby. He lowered his voice. Thank you for telling me. At that moment, the manager appeared, flanked by two suited executives, looking like a man who'd lost control of his kingdom. He spoke loudly, Sir, we should proceed to the next part of your tour. The CEO turned calmly, Actually, I think I'd like to continue speaking with the workers. That's where we'll learn the most, don't you agree? The manager's face twitched, but he forced a nod. Of course, sir. The tension exploded when, suddenly, the foreman marched up with a grim expression. He looked at Ben, eyes full of fury. We need to talk. Now. The CEO paused, observing the confrontation. The foreman, realizing the CEO was watching, tried to mask his anger. Excuse me, sir, just some internal housekeeping. The CEO didn't budge. I'd like to hear it. The foreman hesitated, glancing at the manager for backup. The manager gave him a slight nod, as if to say, handle it quietly. The foreman cleared his throat. Our new hire here has been snooping around, causing disruptions. We believe he's been going through restricted areas, accessing files without permission. Ethan's stomach dropped. This was it. They'd found out about Ben's rummaging and note-taking. The CEO turned to Ben, eyebrows raised. Is that true? Ben exhaled, meeting the CEO's gaze. I've been looking for evidence of what goes on here. Unpaid overtime records, safety violations that go unreported, people fired without cause. The foreman's lip curled. That's not your job, or your place. Ben squared his shoulders. Maybe not, but workers are suffering, and management won't address it. So I figured if I documented it, someone higher up might take it seriously. The manager stepped in now, voice dripping with condescension. And who might that be? The press? A lawyer? This kind of behavior violates company policy. A hush fell over the workers who had gathered. Everyone recognized the foreman's stance. It was a direct threat to fire Ben on the spot. The CEO studied Ben, then glanced at Ethan. Is what he's saying true? Ethan swallowed. Yes, sir. People are overworked, threatened, and forced to accept unsafe conditions. Ben's just trying to help. The manager hissed, that's enough. Then he addressed the CEO. Our policy clearly states that any unauthorized access to confidential materials is grounds for termination. I'm afraid this young man has to go. Some of the workers gasped, while others looked away. This was the dreaded moment. Someone was getting publicly axed for daring to stand up. But Ben didn't flinch. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his ID badge. Ethan noticed it looked different from the standard badges the rest of them wore. It had a shiny gold emblem. A flicker of confusion rippled through the watching crowd. Ben turned to the manager, eyes cold. You're absolutely right about company policy. It also states that a designated representative from corporate headquarters can inspect any and all facilities, files, and working conditions at will. The manager blinked, stunned. The foreman's jaw dropped. The CEO's eyes flicked to Ben's badge, and a slow recognition seemed to dawn on him. In that charged moment, Ben revealed the truth. My name isn't just Ben the new hire. I'm actually Benjamin, your new Chief Operating Officer, assigned by the board to audit our manufacturing plants from the inside. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The manager looked like he'd been struck by lightning, stammering, this can't be. The foreman took a step back, confusion and fear warring on his face. The CEO, regaining composure, studied Ben carefully. So you're the person the board sent to do an undercover evaluation? Ben nodded, turning to the CEO. I wanted to see the real conditions. And I've seen them, loud and clear. The CEO rubbed his temples, a mixture of surprise and concern crossing his features. He glanced at the manager, who stood there pale as a sheet. So all this time, you've been lying to me about how well run this facility is. The manager blubbered, we were just, trying to manage, to keep production high. Chaos erupted as the workers, in shock, began murmuring, some even cheering quietly. People realized the new hire they'd been helping and confiding in was actually one of the top corporate officers. Ethan stared at Ben in disbelief. He never imagined the quiet but determined man was part of the executive suite. The CEO addressed Ben, voice tight. I appreciate your effort to see the ground reality, but you should have informed me of your presence here. Ben's gaze didn't waver. If I had, I wouldn't have seen the truth. The manager and the foreman would have staged the same show you saw this morning. We all know how that goes. The CEO inhaled, then turned a steely eye on the manager. Let's talk in private. Now. The manager visibly trembled, but followed the CEO along with the executives into an office. A hush settled among the workers left standing on the factory floor. People looked at Ben with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. Some wondered if he was about to crack down as harshly as the manager did. Others felt vindicated that their complaints had reached someone high up. Ethan's mind spun. So that's why Ben asked so many questions, took those notes, risked rummaging around. He was collecting data for a top-level audit. Suddenly, the last few weeks made sense. His unwavering conviction, his refusal to be intimidated, his knowledge of labor laws. The foreman, who hadn't followed the CEO, seemed frozen in place, eyes glued to the floor. A wave of anxious energy rippled through the crowd. What would happen next? Would the manager be fired, demoted? Would the entire factory get shut down? And what would become of the workers? The sense of uncertainty was crushing. After a long silence, Ben turned to the assembly line workers, many of whom still hovered nearby, unsure if they should return to their tasks. "We'll figure this out," he said quietly, voice carrying a compassion that no one had ever heard from a supervisor. "I promise." He looked at Ethan, his expression softening. "Thank you for helping me, for trusting me." Ethan was still reeling. He managed a shaky nod, too stunned to form proper words. He thought back to their first encounter, when Ben didn't even know how to clock in. Now he understood, that moment wasn't an act. Ben genuinely didn't know how to punch in because he'd never actually been a factory worker. Yet the sincerity in his desire to fix things was real. Ethan felt a surge of hope, mixed with the realization that the stakes had just skyrocketed. If Ben was truly in a position of power, maybe real changes were on the horizon. Or maybe management's corruption ran so deep that even he couldn't fix it. Everything hung in the balance. As the news spread that Ben was actually a high-level corporate officer, the entire factory spiraled into a frenzy. Some workers were thrilled, hoping this meant an end to the exploitation they'd endured. Others were suspicious, worried that Ben might just be another suit playing a role. Meanwhile, the manager was behind closed doors with the CEO, presumably getting read the riot act. Every minute that passed without a clear outcome only magnified the collective anxiety. Ethan tried to focus on his job, but his hands trembled with adrenaline. Every time a supervisor passed by, he half expected them to shout, "Everyone go home, the plant's shutting down." Instead, they looked as tense and uncertain as everyone else. A deafening quiet settled over the usually noisy floor, as though the entire operation was holding its breath. After what felt like an eternity, the manager emerged face tight. He strode across the factory with purposeful steps, ignoring everyone's questioning looks. Then the CEO came out, followed by Ben, the foreman, and a handful of executives. They were speaking in low tones, their expressions grim. The CEO walked to the center of the floor, motioning for the workers to gather around. Supervisors scrambled to comply, herding people into a loose circle. The manager stood off to the side, arms folded, face unreadable. The CEO cleared his throat. "I've received some concerning reports about working conditions here. We found evidence of unpaid overtime, intimidation tactics, and failure to maintain safety standards." He shot a piercing look at the manager, who had the nerve to appear shocked. The crowd stirred, a ripple of tension. People were afraid to cheer or react, uncertain what this meant for them. The CEO went on, "Because of these violations, we are making immediate changes. First, I want to make clear that forced, unpaid overtime is not acceptable under any circumstances. Any supervisor found forcing workers to stay off the clock will face disciplinary action, up to termination." An audible gasp rose from the crowd. This was the first time they'd ever heard a top executive speak against the status quo so plainly. The manager looked like he wanted to protest, but he held his tongue. "Next," the CEO said, glancing at Ben, "we will be conducting a thorough safety audit. Effective immediately, all repairs to critical machinery must be completed on an urgent timeline. No more delays." Another gasp, this one more subdued, followed by murmurs of relief and hope. Ethan felt a surge of emotion welling in his chest. Could it really be happening? Was the tide finally turning? The CEO continued, "I also want to let you know that there will be no retaliation for speaking up. If anyone is pressured or threatened, they can report it directly to HR or even to my office." The silence was deafening, as no one in the factory had ever heard such words from someone in power. Some workers subtly wiped their eyes, overcome by relief. The manager's face flushed, and the foreman stood with his jaw clenched, clearly furious but powerless to object publicly. The CEO concluded, "I understand trust has been broken, and it will take time to repair. But consider this a new beginning. If there are any immediate concerns, you may speak to your supervisors or to Mr. Benjamin here, who will be conducting on-site follow-ups for the next couple of weeks." All eyes turned to Ben, who stepped forward. He looked around, meeting the gazes of several workers. "I know this is sudden, but we're committed to making things right. We have a lot of work to do, but we'll get through it." Some people applauded tentatively, uncertain if it was truly safe to express joy. Ben nodded, an unspoken promise in his eyes. The CEO signaled for the meeting to end, but as the workers began to disperse, the manager tried to save face. If anyone has any questions, you can come see me or the foreman. I've always maintained an open-door policy. The bitter irony of his statement was not lost on anyone. A few people scoffed, while others glared at him in silence. Shortly after, the CEO and the executives left for a scheduled meeting at a nearby facility, leaving Ben behind. He was now the highest authority on site, and the manager's discontent was obvious. The man approached Ben in a huff, voice low and furious. "I don't know who you think you are, but you humiliated me in front of my workers." Ben's expression hardened. "They're not your workers. They're employees of this company, and you've been abusing your position." The manager's eyes blazed, but he kept his voice down so the surrounding workers wouldn't hear. "You think just because you have a fancy title, you can come in here and disrupt everything? This plant has been profitable for years under my watch." Ben exhaled, controlling his temper. Profit at the expense of people's well-being is not acceptable. And from what I've seen, the profits aren't even as high as they could be, given the inefficiencies you've created with your toxic environment. The manager sneered, stepping closer. "You're meddling in business you don't understand. People need discipline, they're lazy otherwise." Ben bristled. "Discipline is one thing, abuse is another. If you can't tell the difference, maybe you shouldn't be in your position." The manager's fists clenched, and for a moment, Ethan feared he might take a swing at Ben. But the presence of so many workers around made him think twice. Instead, he muttered a string of curses under his breath and stomped away. Ben turned to Ethan, offering a shaky smile. "Guess I've made a new enemy." Ethan chuckled wearily. "You made him sweat, that's for sure. I just hope this all sticks." Ben nodded, scanning the factory floor. "So do I. We have to make sure the changes aren't just on paper." Ethan felt a surge of gratitude. Despite everything, Ben had proven he wasn't just a corporate spy or a stooge. He genuinely wanted to help. And with the CEO's support, maybe real reform was finally on the table. As the shift wound down, word traveled like lightning that the manager had been given a formal reprimand. Some whispered he might be fired soon, while others guessed he'd get demoted or transferred. The supervisors, suddenly fearful for their own jobs, were uncharacteristically polite, offering assistance instead of dishing out insults. It felt surreal, like the factory had entered a new dimension overnight. Yet beneath the cautious optimism, there was still a sense of uncertainty. When would the other shoe drop? Would the manager retaliate against Ben and Ethan once the CEO was out of sight? Would the board follow through on all these promises, or was it just damage control? Ethan found himself drawn to a quiet corner after his shift, leaning against a wall, trying to process everything. Ben approached, tension easing from his features for the first time that day. "Thanks for backing me up," he said softly. "If you hadn't spoken, they might not have believed me." Ethan shrugged, a small smile forming. "You've done more for us in a few weeks than anyone else has done in years. We're lucky to have you on our side." Ben nodded, eyes flickering with determination. "It's not over yet, but we're making progress. Let's keep going until this place is truly safe for everyone." A calm settled between them, a shared understanding that the day's events were a turning point. The public humiliation of the manager and the forced accountability had stirred a glimmer of hope in everyone's hearts. That night, many workers went home feeling lighter, almost joyous. They had seen the tyrants called out in front of their faces, seen real power used to defend them instead of exploit them. For the first time in a long time, the factory didn't feel like a prison. It felt like the beginning of something better. The next morning, the usual tension that greeted workers at the factory gates was replaced by an undercurrent of cautious optimism. The manager had been visibly subdued, and the foreman appeared to be on his best behavior. No yelling, no threats, just curt nods and instructions. For people used to daily harassment, this was a shocking relief. The floor buzzed with hesitant excitement, and whispered conversations about how Ben had orchestrated the manager's downfall circulated. Around mid-morning, the hush broke when a group of workers approached Ben openly, right there on the assembly line. One of them was Mary, the single mother who'd been forced to choose between her child and her job. Another was Harold, the older man who'd been humiliated for working too slowly. They each took a turn expressing their gratitude. Mary said, "Thank you for giving me the courage to stand up. I don't know how many times I wanted to quit." Harold added, "I've never seen management get taken down a peg like that. If we can keep them in check, maybe the rest of my working years won't be so miserable." Ben looked touched. The humility in his voice was genuine. "I'm just doing what anyone with a conscience would do. And I'm not alone. Ethan and Reggie and many others have spoken out. We do this together." A soft applause rippled through the crowd that had gathered. It was a small but powerful moment of solidarity. Even some supervisors lingered nearby, unsure how to react to this new atmosphere. Just then, the manager emerged from his office, a sour expression etched into his features. He saw the group around Ben, then turned sharply on his heel, disappearing back inside without a word. Some might have dismissed his behavior as a sign of retreat, but Ethan felt a pang of worry. Men like that rarely changed overnight. They often bided their time, waiting for a chance to strike back. Still, the immediate aftermath of the CEO's intervention was undeniably positive. Repairs on the frayed cable began that day, and technicians were called in to service malfunctioning machines. The rumor was that corporate mandated it. Near the end of the shift, something extraordinary happened. A representative from HR arrived on the floor, personally speaking with several workers, asking for their experiences and grievances. Normally, HR was a distant department that employees feared, but this rep seemed genuine, armed with forms and a promise that the new corporate directive was to fix problems, not bury them. People were cautious but intrigued. A handful actually gave statements about overtime and safety violations. It was the first time in recent memory that employees felt somewhat safe voicing their concerns. Yet all the good vibes nearly shattered when a sudden shriek echoed from the far side of the factory. People rushed over to find a worker pinned under a piece of machinery. A flawed bracket had given way, sending a heavy mechanical arm crashing down. Panic rippled through the crowd as a few strong men tried to lift it off him. The foreman was barking orders for everyone to stand back, but no one listened. They were too worried about their colleagues' safety. Ben and Ethan pushed through, helping haul the metal arm up. The trapped worker, Sam, was pale, his leg twisted at an alarming angle. Someone called 911, and tension soared as Sam groaned in pain. The manager appeared, flustered, face drained of color. "This can't be happening now," he muttered under his breath. Then, in a louder voice, he tried to take control. "Everyone step away, we have protocols for this." But no one was in the mood to follow his directions. They were too busy trying to comfort Sam until paramedics arrived. Ben knelt beside Sam, carefully supporting his head. "You're gonna be alright," he said gently. Sam winced, tears in his eyes. "This bracket was supposed to be replaced weeks ago," he whispered. The manager overheard, his face growing increasingly red. When the paramedics arrived, they lifted Sam onto a stretcher and whisked him away. The entire factory seemed to hold its breath. Injuries were always covered up or blamed on worker negligence. But this time was different. There were too many witnesses, and it happened right after the CEO's crackdown on safety lapses. The HR rep, who was still on site, rushed to the scene, scribbling notes furiously. The manager tried to intercept her, but she brushed him off. "I need to get statements." The manager glowered, helpless to prevent the scrutiny. In the aftermath, a wave of anger pulsed through the workers. This shouldn't have happened, especially after the promise of immediate repairs. People looked at the manager with raw resentment, some even muttering curses under their breath. Ethan's stomach churned, imagining the pain Sam was in. Meanwhile, Ben's face was a mask of quiet fury. He confronted the manager, voice low and steady. "The bracket that failed, was it on the list for repairs?" The manager sputtered, "That bracket was perfectly fine. If the worker used the machine correctly, this wouldn't have happened." A few bystanders gasped at the blatant deflection. Ben's tone sharpened. "Don't you dare blame Sam. If the bracket was flagged, you're the one at fault." The manager flushed, fists clenching at his sides. Watch your tone, boy. I'm still running this facility. Ben squared his shoulders. That might not be true for long. The manager looked ready to explode, but the foreman quickly stepped in, pulling him away under the pretense of discussing the incident with the supervisors. Left behind, the crowd murmured. Ethan noticed fear creeping back into their eyes. Sam's injury was a harsh reminder that the old dangers still lurked in every corner of this place, and management was still more interested in covering their own backs than protecting their workforce. With the shift ending in chaos, the mood was somber. Mary and Harold approached Ben and Ethan again, faces pale. This is exactly what we were afraid of, Mary said, her voice trembling. Who's next? Harold just shook his head, eyes misty. Ben placed a reassuring hand on Mary's shoulder. I know this is terrifying, but I promise we'll get to the bottom of it. HR's here, and they saw everything. For once, we have proof. Ethan nodded in agreement, although dread coiled in his gut. He'd seen cover-ups before, but maybe, just maybe, the presence of corporate scrutiny would prevent one this time. As the workers filed out, a heaviness settled in the air. Sam was on everyone's mind, and the manager's clear attempt to shift blame only sparked more resentment. That day, the promise of a new beginning collided with the reality of the old injustices, culminating in a raw mix of fear, anger, and faint hope. None of them knew exactly what would happen next, but they all sensed that this was the final tipping point. Something had to give, and it would either be the corrupt leadership or the workers' last shred of trust in the company. For the first time, Ethan found himself yearning for the next day to come quickly, hoping for answers, justice, and maybe even redemption for their battered spirits. The next morning, a palpable tension gripped the factory, more intense than ever. Everyone was on edge, awaiting news about Sam's condition, dreading potential retaliation from the manager, and wondering how corporate would respond to such a blatant safety lapse. Most workers arrived early, gathering in small clusters, murmuring anxiously. Ethan stood with Reggie and Mary, their eyes scanning for any sign of Ben, who often arrived around this time. When Ben finally walked in, a dozen pairs of eyes immediately fixated on him. He wore a solemn expression, but also a determined glint. He wasted no time heading straight to the manager's office. Ethan and Reggie exchanged looks. Should we go with him? Mary asked hesitantly. Ethan shook his head. This is something he might have to do alone. They waited, hearts pounding. Minutes stretched into an hour as production sputtered along, with no sign of Ben or the manager. Then, the door to the manager's office burst open, and out stomped the manager, face purple with rage. His voice carried across the floor as he shouted, "You think you can do this to me? I built this place." The foreman and a few supervisors quickly shut down their stations, rushing to calm him. But the manager was beyond reason, pointing an accusing finger back at his office. Ben emerged calmly, flanked by the HR rep. The manager whirled on him again. "You have no right. This is my facility." Ben fixed him with a cold stare, holding up a folder. "Your facility is violating countless regulations, endangering lives, and employing abusive tactics." The manager practically foamed at the mouth. "Are you calling me an abuser? A liar? After all I've done for production, for this company?" The entire factory fell silent, watching this explosive standoff. Ben's voice trembled slightly, but he remained composed. "Yes, I am. I have a signed statement from Sam, given from his hospital bed, detailing how that bracket was reported faulty weeks ago. I also have multiple witness accounts of your bullying tactics and forced overtime." The manager's hands balled into fists. "You ungrateful wretch. I shaped this factory into a top performer. And you come in here, some rookie corporate hotshot, and act like you know better?" Suddenly, the HR rep stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension. "Enough. This isn't how we address problems. A formal investigation has begun, and we have more than enough to proceed. Effective immediately, you are suspended from your duties." The manager's eyes bugged out, as though he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You can't suspend me." The HR rep held firm. "We can, and we have. Security will escort you off the premises. We'll contact you for further proceedings. An uproar of whispers and gasps echoed across the factory floor. Workers watched in shock as two security personnel approached. The manager tried to shrug them off, but they stood their ground. Furious, he looked around for support, finding only terrified faces. Then he spat at Ben's feet. "Let's see how well you run this dump without me." He stormed out, security trailing behind, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. Some of the workers began to cheer, others simply stared in disbelief. For years, the manager had ruled this place like a petty tyrant. Now, he was gone in a blaze of humiliation. Ben exhaled, shoulders relaxing. The HR rep turned to the gathered crowd. "We will be conducting a thorough review of all supervisory staff. If anyone has information about misconduct, please come forward. This is not a formality. Changes are happening." A wave of relief coursed through the workers. They had witnessed an unprecedented scene. The manager removed in full public view, no chance to bully or harass in private. Some openly wept from sheer emotional release. Mary clutched Harold's hand, tears glistening, while Reggie pounded Ethan on the back in excitement. Ben approached Ethan with a small, tired smile. "We did it." Ethan smiled back, a surge of gratitude overwhelming him. "No, you did it. We just backed you up." A spark of humility crossed Ben's eyes. "We all played a part. Without your honesty and the workers' testimonies, I wouldn't have had enough evidence to take him down. This belongs to everyone." Ethan nodded, feeling tears prick his eyes. He thought about the nightmares he'd had, the constant anxiety, the hopelessness. Now, for the first time, he felt something he could barely remember feeling at work: safe. As the shift went on, word spread like wildfire that the manager was gone. The foreman and other supervisors, sensing the winds of change, became oddly polite, some even helpful. The atmosphere was surreal, like waking up from a bad dream. People still kept their guard up, half expecting some reversal. But with the manager's departure, the biggest source of fear had vanished. Productivity didn't plummet as the manager always claimed it would without his iron fist. If anything, workers felt more motivated, sharing tasks, smiling occasionally. It was as if a weight had been lifted. At lunch, a group of employees banded together, forming a makeshift committee to list out the most pressing safety concerns. They approached Ben with it. "We figure if you can get us some real repairs and maybe some more training, we'll be able to work safer and smarter," said one. Ben accepted the list, scanning it. "This is good. I'll see to it that we address these right away." Another small cheer rose from the group, a hopeful energy spreading. By the end of the day, the transformation was palpable. The dreaded tension that used to cling to every corner was replaced by cautious optimism. People spoke more freely, even joked as they left for the day. Mary left on time, no longer forced to stay unpaid. Harold was assigned to a station more suited to his physical abilities. Reggie talked about how much more they could achieve if they worked collectively to set new standards. Ethan lingered in the factory for a few minutes after clocking out, gazing at the machines. They still needed serious upgrades, and Sam's injury was a stark reminder that this place wasn't magically fixed. But at least now, he believed real change was possible. He turned to Ben, who was busy reviewing some documents with the HR rep. Catching Ethan's eye, Ben nodded, silently conveying that this was just the beginning, that the promise of a better environment could be fulfilled. As Ethan walked out the doors, he felt lighter than he had in years. The humiliation of the manager, the immediate aftermath of the meltdown, and the emotional outpouring of the workers, all of it combined to create a sense of closure. But it was also a new chapter, one where employees weren't just cogs in a machine but people with voices and rights. And at the center of it all stood Ben, the undercover COO who had started out clueless on the clock-in system yet ended up transforming an entire factory. Maybe it was a small victory in the grand scheme of corporate life, but for Ethan, it felt like a hard-earned triumph of humanity over fear. Tomorrow, they'd show up again, face the same machines and quotas, but with a hope that no one could steal away. This was their factory now, and they intended to make it a place where they could all stand tall.